This is Unit 7, Lecture 4, Theories of Emotion. This is one of two lectures that are going to focus on emotion, but of course we know emotion runs throughout this unit as well as this whole course. So this is where we zero in on it, but by no means is this the only time we talk about emotion. Handful of learning targets, and let's get to it. Emotions are a subjective state of mental and physical arousal focused on some event of importance. Make sure you've got that word subjective, because emotions are experienced internally and expressed externally, but then they're open to interpretation. And as we know, on the one hand, the only way to know for sure what someone is feeling is to ask them, but we know that humans are actually really bad judges of their own emotions and being able to express them clearly, because our introspection is definitely flawed, especially when our emotions might be consciously or unconsciously generated in the first place. Emotions are a mixture of physiological activation, expressive behaviors, and cognitive experiences, meaning emotions are mind, body, and behavior experiences. And we don't necessarily know for sure which one comes first. And that's really what our theories in this lecture are going to talk about. So one of the many things that complicates understanding emotions is that we have physiological similarities to different emotions. In other words, our body reacts the same in widely different scenarios. Let's say you were watching the end of a March Madness game and the team you chose to go all the way is down by 2 with 2 seconds to go. Your body might be tense, your heart rate might be up, and you're on the edge of your seat. Well, isn't that the same thing you would feel if you're watching a scary movie, or possibly even if you're out on a first date with someone? You're still going to feel your heart pounding. You still might have sweaty palms. You might be tense all over, but they're going to be for dramatically different emotions. And how do we know which is which? There are some that say, no, emotions come from our body's reaction. And they point to things like the activations of our brain to prove it. The amygdala, and we'll talk about some different parts of the brain throughout this lecture and the next, but here we'll just talk about the amygdala. The amygdala shows differences in activation during emotions of anger and rage. What that is evidence of is that your brain can tell the difference between being kind of angry and being furious beyond measure. And so if your brain looks different under those different conditions, then does it mean that your brain is the thing causing you to feel a different type of emotion? In which case, then your brain is responsible. Your body is responsible for your emotions. We also see evidence that there is certain activity of the left hemisphere, which is different from that of the right hemisphere, namely that positive emotions show up more in the left hemisphere, and when someone describes themselves as feeling a negative emotion, that tends to show up more in the right hemisphere. So there's evidence that the brain hemispheres are also linked to emotion, which again means your body seems to be controlling your emotions. Let's get into the first theory to see what the professionals think. James Lang theory comes from first William James, and he was our first American psychologist, and his partner James Lang. And the fact that he was the first American psychologist is important for review, but also to show that this is a really early stage theory. And what they insisted was that an event, so a stimulus of some kind, here's our stimulus, a snake just crawled out at you from under a bush, and it triggers physiological activity. Your heart rate increasing and your breathing increasing, and it leads to an emotional experience, fear. So your bodily changes ultimately cause you to feel emotions. That actually makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? The problem is, this doesn't explain those situations when your body response is the same but for different emotions and situations. So your heart rate increasing and your breathing increasing could apply to that snake crawling out in front of you, but it could also apply to watching a championship game that's really close, to being nervous for a test or nervous for a date. So that's the critique here, that basically our emotions are more complex, and this completely ignores any sort of cognition of our surroundings. Can Bart kind of agreed with some parts of James Lang, but they tweaked it. And they claimed that emotion and the arousal take place simultaneously. So let's say you walk into a surprise party. Ah, surprise! You have both that physiological response, your heart rate increasing, your breathing increasing, at the same time you feel surprise. You feel shock. Okay. That they happen at the same time. So it's not that your body is telling your emotions what to feel, but they're kind of a partnership and they occur at the same time. Cannon was also the first one to coin fight or flight, which kind of backs this up. The idea that because you're scared, your body reacts in the same way, or because your body is reacting to some sort of danger, you are feeling that emotion. So kind of an interesting connection there. They also insisted that the reason for all of this is that the thalamus, which is one of those core brain parts, is sending messages to your amygdala, your autonomic nervous system, and the cerebral cortex at the same time. So when the thalamus is interpreting a stimulus, it is sending a message to the amygdala for fear or for the emotion at the same time that the autonomic nervous system and the cerebral cortex is directing your body how to react. So that supports this idea that the thalamus is sending messages to multiple places, causing your experience to take different forms all simultaneously. But now on to the theory that seems to be the strongest in the present day. It's the one I like the best, and that's the Schachter-Singer's two-factor theory. And the reason I think it's the best is it actually includes cognition. It includes some credence, some weight to understanding your surroundings. So let's go through it and you'll see what I mean. They claim that physical arousal and a cognitive label happen simultaneously, resulting in feeling an emotion. In other words, the brain names the experience and then you've determined what to feel. So here's the example that I think will help. Let's say you hear thunder and maybe see some lightning. Big boom. At the same time, your heart might skip a beat, but you also have the knowledge of, oh, there's a thunderstorm outside. And so you might feel shocked, like, oh, that startled me, but you're not necessarily feeling fear like something bad, like a bomb went off and oh my gosh, I'm in trouble, okay? Like, or I'm in danger, not in trouble, but like I'm in danger. So your physical reactions and your thoughts together result in your emotion. This seems to make sense, especially if you think about a time where you can't really explain your physical reaction to something at first, but then when you think about where you are and what you're doing, you sort of have that perception of, oh, I must be feeling happy or excited or just nervous, but it's that good nervous, that sort of thing. I'm going to see if I can summarize one of Schachter and Singer's experiments for you that kind of backs this up. Not kind of, that does back this up. They injected some college men with the hormone epinephrine to trigger feelings of arousal. Half of the men were told the injection would help test their eyesight. Something super boring. The other group said that they might experience arousal because of the drug. Then they were told to go into a waiting room where another person, a confederate, in other words, an actor in the experiment, was acting either super irritated or overjoyed. The men who were told that their drug might influence their arousal or their emotions just were able to later on say, like, yeah, that person got excited or irritated. But the people who were told that the drug affected their eyesight actually ended up feeling the same emotion as the confederate. So if he was acting irritated, then so were they. They caught the emotion of their surroundings. So when they started to feel irritated, by not knowing that they had a drug that was going to also change their emotional state, heighten their arousal, they couldn't blame it on the drug like the other group could. They ended up basically blaming it on the actions of the other person. They got caught up in it as well. So in other words, their cognition of their surroundings influenced the emotion that they felt. So far, all of our theories take into account that a stimulus is happening first, that there's some event that's going to happen before your body or your cognition or your emotions react. But are you capable of actually choosing your own emotions or influencing your own emotions? There are two theories that would kind of say, yeah, that's probably possible. The first one is facial feedback theory. And this theory states that emotions and experience of changes in our facial muscles, which create expressions that cue the brain, and then the brain determines the emotion. So it's that whole idea of basically, if you fake it with your face, you will feel that thing. So let me give you an example. If you smile like a big, genuine, eyes squished, cheeks up sort of smile, you're gonna start to feel pleasure. But at the same time, if you let your face fall and you frown, you might start to feel sadness. A small piece of evidence to back this up, a study was done that found that people who got Botox to prevent their brow from furrowing or from frown lines from developing actually felt happier because they were unable to make those sad facial expressions. And it kind of is backed up by the idea that, believe it or not, as I'm making tons of facial expressions as I'm talking to you in the camera, that we have an unlimited amount of muscle configurations in our face. And so therefore, it matches up with the idea that we actually have an unlimited number of emotions. So the idea that you can fake it until you feel it, like fake that smile until you feel happier, it's actually true. In the same way that the facial feedback effect claims that our facial expressions can influence our emotions, there's a follow-up theory that called the behavior feedback effect. And this is the idea that our emotions have the ability to influence our own and others. That's supposed to say our behaviors have the ability to influence our own and others' emotions, thoughts, and actions. Darn it, I'll have to go back and fix that. So our behaviors. Let's just focus on yourself for a second. Imagine that I just told you right now to get up, find a hallway somewhere, and walk down the hall going kind of slow. Look down, kick your feet, maybe frown a little bit. How do you think you'd feel? Probably pretty sad. Now imagine you walk down the hall, your head up, your shoulders back, you're swinging your arms, you're taking big strides, maybe even walking a little bit faster. How are you likely to feel right now? You're likely to feel energized and maybe a little bit more positive. Your behaviors give feedback to your emotions. At the same time, your emotions might give feedback to your behavior. At the same time, that can influence the behaviors and thereby the emotions of the people around you. So if someone says, hey, what flavor ice cream do you want? You're like, I don't care. It doesn't matter. That person is very likely to be like, you're right, it doesn't matter. Who wants ice cream anyways? So your behaviors and emotions are contagious. At the same time, if someone greets you, and this is a big reason why I try to do this every day, every class, if someone greets you with a positive attitude, hey, I'm so glad you're here, it's time for a class, you're more likely to feel that same behavior and thereby that same emotion. One of my favorite theories. Now I'm going to change my behavior to be a little bit more serious and focused because this last chunk takes a little bit of a complicated churn and I want you with me. So we have this debate throughout these theories about how important cognition is to emotion. Like, do you need to understand what's happening in order to feel something? And instead of saying, yes, like Dr. Singer would say, absolutely, you need cognition, and then some of the others wouldn't even factor it in, there's kind of a solution. And the solution is that maybe it's both. We actually have two routes of emotion. And for the moment, just looking at this diagram, just watch. We'll worry about taking notes in a second. But let's go through what I mean by two routes of emotion, like two ways that it gets processed in your brain. Let's say you see that snake we were talking about earlier. And that stimulus goes into your vision and it hits the thalamus. Remember your thalamus, and I should have said this earlier, but your thalamus is your sensory switchboard. Hopefully that rings a bell. And because you're seeing the snake, that image has to go to your visual cortex, and then it has to go to your prefrontal cortex where your sense of judgment is, and then it goes to your amygdala, which helps you react to emotions. And then the rest of your body might respond, perhaps by screaming and running away or standing on a table or something. I don't know. So that is considered the thinking high road. Like, you need to recognize that that's not just a stick on the sidewalk, that's a snake. You need that sense of cognition, and then you've got to process it before you have your emotional reaction. And that could happen. But you also have this pathway where you might see something dangerous and have a fear stimulus that goes to your thalamus, but it is so dangerous, or you process it so quickly that it goes straight to the amygdala and your body has that instant flight or fight response. In other words, a faster, low road to experiencing emotion. So in other words, an event could lead to a cognitive appraisal and then the emotional response, or an event could go straight to an emotional response. We have actually three more names to throw at you. The Sayonk and Ledoux. A psychologist believed that emotional reactions can be quicker than our interpretation of the events. We feel before we think. That, yeah, it is possible, especially when there's a quick emotional response before our intellect intervenes. Like, we see that scary spider and we just get scared before we even stop to think about the fact that we could just step on that spider with our shoe. Our emotions occur separately from our cognition, or maybe prior to our cognition, and that's where that idea of like a gut feeling comes from. That it happens so darn fast you can't even put your finger on what it is that's making you feel that given way. Research supports this idea that a low road does exist because it's identified some neural pathways that run directly from the eye and the ear to the thalamus to the amygdala without actually going up to the cortex, which means it's possible. Meanwhile, one last theory for you is Lazarus. He believed that even instantaneously felt emotions require some sort of cognitive appraisal. So make sure you underline that, because his theory is actually considered the cognitive appraisal theory. That even though it might be super duper fast, we have to know what we're responding to. So appraisal might be effortless and unconscious, but it's still happening. It's just happening in such a split second. So appraisal meaning like cognition, you're thinking about it, that it happens in such a fast way that you really just can't separate it. But again, how do you know whether to be scared at the snake or think it's no big deal because it's just a stick? Your brain has to get involved. One more summary for you to help you put it all together. Zayonk and Ledoux believed that an event needs to happen, and it is possible to go straight to an emotional response, that you wouldn't necessarily need to think about it first, that it's immediate. Lazarus, supporting the ideas of Schachter and Singer, would say, no, you must have a cognitive appraisal. You must think about what's in front of you or what's happening to you in order to determine your emotion. And you can feel the emotion of relief because this lecture is over.